Well, hello everybody. And I've been, while Daniel was talking, I was skimming quickly through the um, list of people who have signed on for this talk, and it was quite fun to see several people who I recognize anyway by name from our various trips in the past. So welcome to you and anyone who we've not met before, who I hope might be encouraged to sign on for one of these tours. So my um, talk today is I was asked to talk about a research project or work that I'm doing at the moment, rather than just, as it were, the sort of talk I might give if I was lecturing on the bus or in a cafe somewhere in Bukhara. And so I thought I'd talk about a project that I've been working on for several years, but has really crystallized in the last couple of years on the illustration of history. And the idea behind this is to look at Persian manuscripts of chronicles and historians, historical works, and see which scenes have been chosen for illustration, because history, after all, is a series of events. And more or less factually determined and chronologically determined. I think on the whole, most people would think historians at least record the basic facts reasonably accurately or diligently. But in a history of anybody, a famous character like Tamerlane or anybody else, there are many, many events and facts and episodes in their life and career or in the wider history of the whole Islamic world. And so how do you decide what to illustrate amongst all this, and why do you bother to illustrate it at all? And when you've decided to illustrate it, how do you illustrate it? Do you stick to the information you have in the text that you're depicting, or do you dream up some fantasy of your own? And so it's a project that raises many interesting questions, it seems to me, about how the past is represented and how it's made accessible and visible to later generations, and indeed even to contemporaries. And one of the points that I hope will emerge in this talk is that none of these paintings are actually even attempting accurately to depict events that happen. So they have zero documentary value. In other words, you can't look at a Persian manuscript of one of Timur's battles, Tamerlane's battles, and say, oh yes, that's a marvelous depiction of how the battle looked and how it was. All the pictures that we're going to see today are painted sometime after the event by people who were never there, and they may have heard something about it, and they may have been able to read the chronicles in the manuscript that they're illustrating, but very possibly not. So we're talking about a sort of a stratum of adornment to a chronicle, which may simply be there to beautify the book, or it may have other purposes to emphasize particular events and to give readers, essentially, readers and viewers of these manuscripts, which of course were basically precious and weren't seen by many people, some view of how things might have been, or more particularly, what are the important events in Timur's career that are worth illustrating. Now, talking about creating an image of Tamerlane, I don't know why now this is the first problem. I don't seem to be able to make my PowerPoint advance to the next frame. There's presumably a reason for this. Are you there, Claire? Why can't my button press in the normal way?
Is it?
Well, it's gone too now.
There you
go. I need to, maybe it was, I'm just incredibly delayed. I need to go back. Sorry about this. Why on earth is it not going back? I thought these things were more or less automatic. Thousands of Zoom lectures in the last year or so. Well, this is most annoying. I seem, no, all I can see is my screen with a map on it, which is not what I want to see.
Is there a button at the bottom?
There
Bottom
is.
left-hand side.
Yes.
Uh,
Move the cursor.
oh, I see. I can do it down
Side,
there.
Charles.
Yeah, I
There you
can see it.
go.
It's down there. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. And how do I go the other way?
And then it's behind the shield. The forward would be behind the shield.
I
That's
get
it
it.
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
I was stupidly thinking my computer would be able to do this. Okay, let's start again. So creating an image of Timur, we need to know who he was, but I guess most of you are familiar, at least with the basics, that he was this great conqueror who was born in around about 1336 and who died in 1405, and in the process swept across most of Western Asia. One of the images we might have of Timur in the West, and by far the most popular image, is the fact that he is supposed to have put the Ottoman Sultan in a cage and carried him around with him after the Battle of Ankara in 1402. Here we have a typical, I would say, Orientalist depiction. There's always a girl more or less semi-naked in these things. And this is the main image we have of Timur in the West that he defeated, which he did, the Ottoman Sultan, and put him in a cage. We also have plays by Christopher Marlowe, which you can read for yourself how he was described there. And Racine's play also called Bajazet, which is supposed to be, of course, Bayezid, who was the Ottoman Sultan. So in other words, in the West, we have a very particular image of Timur, basically ill-informed by most people, that he was this sort of savage conqueror, and his main exploit was to put the Ottoman Sultan in a cage. Here we have opera by Handel and also by Vivaldi. And of course, there's no monopoly on the interpretation of these events in librettos or in theatre productions. And this astonishing poster I found bottom left there, with, I don't know what that girl thinks she's doing with her hairdo like that, but essentially, of course, it's got very little to do with the story. So we can see that there's an endless visual and graphic way of engaging with the story and the career of Tamerlane. Just draw your attention to the one on the right, the Handel opera notice, because actually here, at least the person producing the poster has had the decency to take an image from a medieval manuscript of Timur's life. Well, it's interesting to start with that there's no sign of Timur putting Bayezid in a cage in Persian manuscripts. So here we have two later. At the top here, I've just, for the sake of propriety, put the name of the manuscript. This is in Istanbul, and it's written in about 1520. And this is in the British Library, and it's written 1552. So we're already 150 years after the death of Timur. But these two miniature paintings, they're very attractive. They're in very beautifully illustrated manuscripts. You see the lovely flowing calligraphy. We see down here Bayezid being brought in. And down here we see him being presented as well to Timur, who's sitting here in a very characteristic pose with his leg down and one sort of squatting on his throne, and exactly the same here. Anyway, these are just an example of many of the type of illustration we're going to see in these Persian manuscripts. And as I mentioned, these are already 150 years after the death of Timur, and they have no resemblance whatsoever to how events might have actually appeared at the time. But the point I want to make is that he's not in a cage. So, as I mentioned, Timur, of course, had this great conquest. I'm afraid it's not a brilliant map. I tried to color it in myself to make it slightly more accessible. But here we see his main capital at Samarqand. And it's thanks to distant horizons and to some extent to my own initiative that I ever got to see Samarkand, because the idea was that we'd combine a tour of Central Asia with Iran. And these are really the main limits of his conquests. Ankara, which is where he defeated the Ottoman Sultan in 1402, Delhi, which he sacked in 1399 to 1400, and then these great battles up here on the steppes of the north of the Caspian Sea against the Golden Horde. and incidentally sacking Baghdad and Damascus. So he ranged really from Damascus to Delhi, from this capital, and numerous campaigns, as we see here. And these were characterized by extreme brutality. He was an extraordinarily successful general. I don't think he ever lost a battle. He was a terror. And this is not an image that one would imagine be terribly attractive. But of course, he did found a dynasty, and he had qualities of rulership, which sort of acted as a model, one could say, for later dynasties, because one of the things about medieval history, especially in Asia, is that you need a ruler who's really in charge and is going to control things and is going to create a period of more or less stability. Well, it's debatable if really Timur's reign was stable, because it was characterized by all these military campaigns, but nevertheless, he established a great empire. And this was an inspiration to later dynasts, whether they be the Ottomans themselves or the Moguls in India, or successor regimes of descendants of Genghis Khan in Central Asia itself. Here we see how Timur has become the sort of godfather of modern Uzbekistan. He has this forbidding picture, which I think, as you'll see from some of the miniature paintings, is surprisingly consistent. And the picture I started with on my first slide is actually a famous model of his skull made by a Russian sculptor and ethnographer when his body was dug up from his tomb, and they made a cast of his face. So we do have actually quite a realistic idea of what he looked like. And the extraordinary thing is, in a way, most of the miniature paintings do characterize him in a fairly similar way. Here we have a sort of post-Soviet celebration of frog marching soldiers and brass bands, and this must have been some event connected with his anniversary while on one of our tours. Anyway, so to cut a long story short, Timur is really regarded now almost as the father of modern Uzbekistan, and a great figure and an empire builder, and someone who is thoroughly to be admired, and whose legacy is to be understood and appreciated. There are different ways of visualizing this. The most concrete one, or perhaps the most brick-like one, is to look at the architecture he left behind, because this is a permanent and material memorial in a way that, of course, ephemeral manuscript paintings and manuscript books themselves are not. Some of you will have been to Arc Sarai in Shahrukh Sabz, and this absolutely massive palace that he created there. You see the scale partly from a couple of tiny figures there, and one must bear in mind the top has come off. So between there and there was another arc to make it even higher. I didn't have I been muted all the time? Anyway.
No, you haven't. No.
I don't know why I was suddenly muted. I certainly didn't do it myself. Anyway, so this absolutely massive building, which is a memorial to Timur at his birthplace. I think some of our previous travelers are down here. This doesn't look like this anymore, incidentally. One of the interesting things about travel, especially if you go repeatedly, and see how things have changed. And I regret to say that Shahrukh Sabz has been more or less knocked down, not the palace itself, of course, but the environs. So here, very briefly, is a sketch of what Samarkand was like. This is Timur's capital within a century of his death. The mosque we're going to see in a moment is here, Timur's mosque, and then his the famous Registan Square. And just a little bit along from that is his mausoleum. So this is the Bibi Khanum Mosque. And as I say, this is a sort of way of visualizing or illustrating Timur because it shows the enormous scale on which he was operating, the megalomania of the man. This is, again, a truncated building which has largely collapsed and being repeatedly and serially restored over the years because the restorations aren't very well done, I'm afraid, and they tend to fall down. So this is the famous mosque in honor of his wife, Bibi Khanum, and here is his very beautiful mausoleum, which ended up being a family mausoleum with his own tombs there and those of most of his successors and the next generation. So I say this is one way of memorializing Timur in a very specific material sense. I mean, these monuments remain. But I'm going to look at the manuscript illustrations of his career. I thought this might be helpful just to show you what I'm going to say. The first illustrated manuscript is dated 1436, so that's already 30 years after Timur's death. And it's called the Zafarname, which means the Book of Conquests, by a man called Ali Yazdi. And numerous illustrated copies of this text were created up until the early 17th century. And that would be the most obvious source of illustrations of his career because it's a history of Timur himself. But of course, Timur features more generally in the history of Iran. So other chroniclers, and especially so-called universal chroniclers, which go through all the different dynasties, they also have sections on Timur. And there's one chronicler in particular called Mirkhand, who was writing in the second half of the 15th century, and he has a chapter on Timur, and in fact his volume on Timur is the most illustrated of all the volumes, in surviving volumes anyway, of his chronicle. So this again is what I would say pure history, as distinct from legend and what you might even call historical novels, which clearly are, or romances, historical romances, which have a basis in history, of course, but they're not supposed to be professional historical works. But then we cross a line with the poet Hatifi, who was writing in Khorasan around Herat, right at the end of the 15th century, and he wrote a verse chronicle called the Timur Name. Name means book in Persian. So the Book of Timur, which is a verse chronicle, except it's not a chronicle, of course, it's a sort of legendary romance about Timur. So the interesting thing is that we see Timur going from being a serious historical figure as recorded by the chroniclers and then by later chroniclers to become the object of poetic treatment and legendary and romantic poetry. The interesting thing is that the pictures, or the scenes, I should say, perhaps, that were chosen from his career to be illustrated are pretty consistent across these different works and these different genres. And it's perhaps no surprise to anybody to learn that the main episodes that are thought to be king-like and monarchical are fighting and feasting and hunting. If a ruler is doing these things publicly and effectively, of course, it's great for his image, and it means he's a real man and a real king and a real dynast. So many of the pictures are simply pictures of battles, pictures of feasts, pictures of hunts, and I call them generic because there's nothing to distinguish them. I mean, they're all just pictures of hunts. It could be any hunt, anywhere, at any date, in any landscape. The only thing that differs a little bit are some of the animals, which we'll see. And then, however, there are a few, in other words, you don't know where you are. You could look at one of these pictures, whether you read the text around it or not. And, you just realize that it's the ruler hunting. It's not specific. But there are a few events which are picked on, which are specific, and that means the iconography helps you identify immediately what the scene is, because it's associated with a particular episode or a particular action. that you can locate. You say, well, I know what that is. That's a picture of Timur doing something like that. But in every case, they're not realistic. And as you'll see from the pictures, they are, in fact, very colorful. They become more and more attractive and less, I would say, meaty, and less really giving the atmosphere of what it must have been like to be wrapped up in these events. And then just briefly at the bottom, the main centers of production are southern and eastern Iran. I called Herat in Iran because, of course, it was in those days Bukhara and India. And we'll see a difference between the pictures created in India from those created in Iran. Right, so to get on with it, here is some early battles of Timur. This gives you an idea. You could see this could be anybody, really. Two armies against each other, both identically dressed, and both really with the same horse equipment and the same armor and the same sort of atmosphere. Some of them are adorned with these splendid drummers up on the horizon and these terrific trumpets. In other words, there are standard elements in these paintings, usually a sort of rounded hillside like this with some floral vegetation, usually a stream. This is a stream that's become oxidized. This is a stream down here with pretty rocks. These pictures could be anything. This is the first manuscript, and the one made in 1436 on the order of Timur's grandson. And I think you'll see what I mean here, that this painting, and there are several others in this manuscript, which are far more sinister. There's a heavy use of black. There's a real sense of a forbidding military forces in action with their scimitars and their casquettes, and generally dramatic and forceful in a way that many of the later depictions aren't. So this is one of the main themes. I'm afraid, I don't know for you, but for the top of my screen, I can't actually see the heading up here, but it's Timur attacking a man called Toqtamish Khan, who was the ruler of the Golden Horde and was a great rival. He was a descendant of Genghis Khan, unlike Timur himself. And Timur's career of conquests was very much inspired by the desire to sort of reconquer the conquests of Genghis Khan and consolidate his empire that had fallen to had been fragmented after his death, and get it all back under one dispensation. Anyway, this is the Battle of Toqtamish Khan, which is one of the events that is most popularly depicted. And this, as I say, because it was a very important to Timur. This the Golden Horde was one of the splinter polities that grew out of the sort of fragmentation of Genghis Khan's empire. So here we have it again. Very different, I think. And you'll see that this is from this other book, the Mir Khan's book, the one writing, the chronicler writing later in the 15th century, so 150 years later, and his section in a universal chronicle of the reign of Timur. So just to show as a brief example how the same topic is depicted over different texts and different periods, and of course in a very different way as well. I think this is defeating the Indians. I don't know how to get rid of the panel on the top there. But anyway, 1399, Timur famously invaded India and sacked Delhi and put an end to the regime that was there, and created mayhem and brought back a huge booty. This at least has some sort of Indian component. You see the elephants here help you locate in India. And in fact, the fact that his adversaries here have got dark skins is also a convenient way of depicting the Indians. So the fight against Toqtamish Khan of the Golden Horde was one key element of his career, and the sacking and the invasion of India was another. One of the specific, I mentioned there were specific scenes that aren't so generic. And also one of the things particularly associated with Timur was his brutal habit of decapitating the bodies of his defeated enemies and building towers of skulls. So here we see a tower of skulls going up here, and here we see another tower of skulls going up here. And this was a way, of course, of terrifying would-be enemies into submission before it got to that stage. This isn't necessarily an attractive characteristic of Timur. These pictures, however, somehow make it look as though it's sort of more or less a normal afternoon out. Well, here we have some bodies being thrown over the cliff. It's true, I suppose it's not entirely attractive, but nevertheless, I would say the pictures are attractive rather than repulsive. Now, I mentioned the difference between Indian and Persian depictions. This is a very famous and rather understudied manuscript commissioned by Akbar the Great Mogul, who of course was a descendant of Timur. He commissioned this manuscript of Timurid history in the 1580s, fairly early on in his career, late 1580s, early 1590s. And this is a specific scene recorded in the chronicles with some horror of when Timur attacked Isfahan. He told all his soldiers to bring in a head and they would get paid. And to start with, they were doing this, and then they got so fed up with it, and the prices were going down, and they hired other people to bring in the heads. But here, you see, we do have this, I wouldn't say realistically, but some effort at imagining a real scene. So here we have the scribe or the clerk or the accountant, whatever, writing down the heads and who's bringing them in, with a view to paying them later. So this is in a very different. It seems to me this does capture some of the sort of horror of Timur's career. But here we have some more. This is, of course, the word for a tower is a minar, or minara, which is the same as a minaret. And sometimes the artists are a bit confused. They put in a minaret that you might see in a mosque. Here, someone's having his head gorgeously cut off, and there it's going to be hauled up here on a piece of string, and it's going to be part of that. This one there, all being bricked in another way. But you can see that the chroniclers record these scenes. They don't cover them up, and that the artists tend to fix on them. There are several paintings of different events, of course, of towers of skulls being built, but they are something that is obviously considered to be significant enough to be depicted when there are so many actions that could be. Another specific scene, and again, one that occurred on 2 or 3 different occasions, Timur's military skill in defeating some of his enemies in the mountains who took refuge in caves was to put his troops into, they're called a box, a sunduk, but actually it's the sort of thing that a window cleaner might be lowered down. I can't think offhand of a better word than box for that. It's not quite a tray. But anyway, you can see them being lowered down from above. And again, this is a sort of reasonably serious effort to depict how it might have been, and it's not quite so fanciful, and again has a sort of movement and darkness and rather sinister quality about it. But this shows guns and things, all sorts of elements that wouldn't have been present at the time. So perhaps another point to make, a more general point, is that the paintings depict the material culture of the time they were painted. So a feast scene painted in 1580 in a Persian court would have the ceramics and the metalwork and the uniform, the clothing that the artist would have been familiar with. In other words, there was no effort to archaize this, to make it look as though what Timur's soldiers would really have been wearing. So I mentioned, so that's his military side. So warfare, of course, is one of the major efforts that distinguished his career, and also the attributes that are expected of Incidentally, is the right-hand side of this image cut off? Because it is for me.
Seeing it, Charles, I think you're okay.
Okay, good. I'm just trying to get rid of myself a bit, actually. I just realized I'm blocking up my own view of the picture. Anyway, I can't do any more. Anyway, so hunting was another great thing. Of course, this is not exclusive to Iran. I mean, all the medieval rulers in Europe and no doubt in China were hunting. And this was simply to get food. It was recognized, of course, it was a very good way of military training when you weren't actually fighting. It involved coordination, discipline, horsemanship, skillful use of weapons. And there's a particular sort of hunt called the jirga, or ring hunt, which is a splendid example of this, because the troops would come in from miles around over several days, driving the animals in front of them into a ring. And this obviously required very good communications, coordination of troop movements and so on. And then a bit of a slaughter, unfortunately, because the animals were trapped in these rings. That's rather a sickening sight. But on the other hand, of course, if you didn't kill food, you didn't get any. And so that was how it worked. So there are many pictures of Timur hunting, and often they're allied with military campaigns, perhaps not surprisingly, because there's a limit to how much food you could take with you on a campaign. So in Georgia, where he was lowering his troops down the mountainsides to attack the Georgians, there would be a great hunt probably after the battle, as a rule, partly as a reward. And this, I think, is, I can't see what it says up there, but it may say, well, it doesn't really matter, does it, where it is? I can't see what it is. And another interesting point I might mention here is, or in the next one perhaps, that often the pictures are in exactly the same place in the manuscript. Here, if you can read this, Azanja something Manzel Bra Bar Dasht, or something like that. It's not terribly clear. And here we have the same line up here. Azanja Suye Manzel Ra Bar Dasht. You see, the poem comes in the very similar, the painting comes in the very same position in the text. And this is something you find periodically, and is very interesting, because has the artist seen where other painters have illustrated the text? Has the painting been inserted into the text in a certain place because it's always put there, or because this is the natural place? In other words, creating a strong link between the image and the text. And this is something that's an important part of my research, because it's one thing having a nice picture of a hunt, and it's another thing having a nice description of a hunt. But is there any association between the two, not only in terms of proximity, but is actually the details of the hunt, are they reflected in the details in the painting? So when you see them in the same place in the text, it's quite interesting. Here again, we have the same. This line of poetry there is the same as this line of poetry down there. So there's a remarkable consistency in where these paintings are done. This is on the Indian campaign. And here we see these wild animals, which of course the artist had probably never seen. And this shows something exotic and unusual. We have a peacock up there, and fabulous birds. I mean, they're beautiful paintings, but they, as I say, they could really be any hunt anywhere for the most part. So that's hunting, which is one of the great subjects. And then the third of the three elements, I mentioned hunting, warfare, hunting, and feasting. Feasting can be for a number of reasons. Of course, it could just be having a party, but it's usually a domestic event, or dynastic, perhaps, rather than domestic. It might be a marriage within the royal family. It might be a funeral within the royal family. It might be the ruler just making a decree and exercising justice. So here we have a very popular scene, again, out of so many, This is the wedding of his son, Jahangir, who died before him. Those of you who've been to Shahrisabz will perhaps remember his rather splendid mausoleum in Shahrisabz with a tall brick and rounded sort of conical dome, which is a particular element of the Khwarezmian style of architecture. So this is a feast. This is the young Prince Jahangir getting married to the blushing bride. Very often the girl doesn't appear in the picture because of the sensibilities of having ladies present. But on the whole, we can see very similar things. You see, look, we've got these the metalware. There's very similar, the bowls of fruit are very similar. He's sitting there in this characteristic pose with one leg tucked up. The instruments are quite similar, rather a fabulous lute there. So for historians of material culture, these paintings have some genuine value, because as I said, these are the sort of things the artist would be familiar with and would see at court, which wouldn't necessarily be the sort of things that were actually there at the time. I think the one on the left is Jahangir, and I think this is Shahrukh's wedding after a victory in Khwarezm. And this is another picture of that, a double page illustration. You see, they've got these fabulous Mongol owl feather helmets, and this tells you that they're painted in the Safavid era, which is the 16th century, because these batons they put in their turbans, it was a sign of the a new regime. Almost all these events are out of doors. Of course, the Timurids, they were nomads, basically, like the Mongols before them. They lived a life, even in their so-called palaces. They were basically enormous tents outside the cities, and all these beautiful gardens and pools, running water, ducks, fowl, everything. Shortly before he died, you see these pictures of Timur aren't so amazingly different from the skull and from the statue that you may remember from I showed earlier. He's again in a characteristic pose. We've got exactly the same sort of equipment lying around. We've got a girl playing her harp there. He's holding out a wine cup, a cup there, about to pour it. He's holding exactly the same gesture. And so one thing to say is that although the pictures are all very different, I mean, in terms of style and color scheme and composition even, there are very conservative attachment to specific features, which go on right through the whole range from really the 15th century right through to the 17th century. The elements, the ingredients of the pictures are more or less the same, even though the way they're depicted and the appearance of the painting itself, of course, varies over time. But what we're seeing is the same event. It's Timur holding this great akurultai, is a Mongol word for a sort of assembly. It's like a moot in medieval Britain, where everyone comes together and they decide what's going to happen next, and there's a marriage, and he's basically leaving. He's towards the end of his life, leaving his testimony to for his successors. And then we have the sad death of Timur himself. Here he is lying here in probably healthy looking, and here's the horror and the misery, and the ladies up there mourning, and everybody in their blue and their black, which are the traditional colors of mourning. So we go through his whole life, and just, of course, I've only picked up a tiny sample of these pictures, and these are mainly from the history of Ali Yazdi, his actual history of Timur. As I say, many scenes are reproduced in later chronicles, but to nothing like the same extent. And it's interesting that there's less focus in later chronicles on India, for instance, and there's more on the Ottomans and events in the West, because Timur sacked Damascus. He tried to conquer the Mamluk Sultan. He defeated the Ottoman Sultan, as we see, and the emphasis tends to shift in later manuscript illustrations of these events in the West, which are more remote from the events in Samarkand in the East and North India, which wasn't really part of the horizons anymore of the contemporaries in the 16th century. Well, just to finalize, I mentioned this poem, Hatif's Timur Name, and these are, I've got 4 images quickly to follow because they show the same subject being illustrated. So this is Jahangir's wedding. That's the eldest son of Timur, who died before Timur and was very much lamented by him. This was a very relatively nice manuscript that came up in Sotheby's a couple of years ago. It's got rather spoiled. You can see there's some tarnish there, but essentially, you know, it's quite nice. And the fact is, you didn't just automatically order an illustrated copy of these books. So it makes them precious. There's a rarity. They may be for gifts. They may be for personal enjoyment. But it's another element of the whole question of why were texts illustrated, because these aren't for the general public. You know, it's not like the Cambridge Illustrated History of this or the Cambridge Illustrated History of that. These are rare books. They were rare at the time, and they're even rarer now. And so we're really talking to ourselves, if you like. I mean, the artist is at court in the royal atelier, or else he's in the commercial atelier receiving commissions, which is what happened in Western Europe, of course, the famous schools in Paris and in Burgundy and elsewhere, where the rulers would hire commercial craftsmen and artists to produce beautiful books for them. So it's the same idea, but of course we know far less about that, unfortunately, when it comes to Iran, far less at the moment. So anyway, I certainly know far less about it. Toqtamish Khan, he appears always. He's one of the few guaranteed pictures, even in a manuscript where it may only be 3 or 4 illustrations. This, you can probably tell, is produced in India. So it's a Persian manuscript that traveled to India. And this is also quite a common phenomenon. This space was almost certainly left blank. And the manuscript traveled to India and was then illustrated later. This is back to the Sotheby's one. You see Timur's attack on India is once again a very popular subject. And that's picked up in the course of this poem. And you see here we have these rather extraordinary looking characters who are supposed to, I suppose, look like Indians. We really are in the realm of fantasy. But again, the important point is it's the same topics being depicted and singled out for depiction against the whole background of all the different ones. And then here we have Timur defeating the Ottoman Sultan. Again, this is the manuscript that was completed in India, but written, I think, in Bukhara, and then was not completed there, or possibly written in Herat and went to Bukhara and then ended up in India, which is often the case. So I'd like to thank you for your patience. And I've only lost 11 participants in the course of this. I think we started with 100 and now we're down to 89. So I think that's not too bad. I leave you with this picture from the first of the manuscripts, the one in 1436, showing Timur hunting. And again, this is a fantastic depiction of the natural world, which is in the end far more realistic than the depiction of the human world. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, Charles, thank you very much. I hope everyone can see me now. You must have covered the subjects very comprehensively. We only have one question. Is everyone there? We have one question, Charles.
Right.
I think some scripts in the earlier images that you gave would seem to be typical of Persian script, but others not.
Right.
Is this a question of geography, perhaps style, or just personal choice?
Well, the calligraphy became quite standardized. I mean, professional calligraphers would write in something that was peculiarly Persian script called nastali, which is a very nice flowing sort of hanging script. And that was pretty consistent. The earliest one, that's well spotted, and actually also the last picture I showed is in a different script, which is more upright. It's called naskh. And that's not really a case of geography. It's just a choice, and that's actually quite an unusual hand that manuscript is in. Most of the others were in a very similar hand by professional calligraphers. I mean, a manuscript of this type, in other words, an artistic production, would have a professional scribe. It's an interesting point whether the scribe actually understood what he was writing. I mean, it seems quite extraordinary that they wouldn't, but there is evidence, and in fact there are specific statements that they were illiterate and they were simply copying a text. I mean, personally, I find this almost impossible to believe. But you know, well, I mean, you can choose for yourself just the way I can. I mean, I don't know, I wasn't there, but the style of this very cursive script was developed in the late 14th century. So it was in its infancy, really, when these manuscripts were started to be produced. The illustrated manuscripts started to be produced. And I think that first one, which is in the naskh script, was the more, that's the script, for instance, the Quran is usually written and was the prevalent script at the time.
Charles, the questions are now coming in. What light, if any, do these amazing images throw on the actual facts about Timur? Or are they perceptions and perhaps as a more archaic form of what we now call history?
Yes, well, this is absolutely goes to the point of what I was trying to say. They have no documentary value at all, except as I mentioned, in terms of the material culture, you know, clothing, armory, you know, pots and pans, to put it in a crude way. The artists were never an eyewitness. They may conceivably, some of the earliest ones, there's a view that one of the battle scenes in the early on, that 1436 manuscript, is a reasonably accurate depiction of what the battle might have looked like. But quite honestly, it's an act of faith to believe that, because it's very stylized, just like all the later ones. And you see, this gets, I mean, this is in a way the point of my research, and I haven't sort of finished, and I haven't got a definitive answer. But the question is really, why were these books illustrated? Why was it necessary? Why do you illustrate any book, for that matter? Of course, there are many obvious answers. One is just to make them more attractive and to give people an idea of what it might look like. But, you know, it's not like a modern photographer going to a riot or a battle or a car crash or something and taking a photograph and recording the scene. And this is how it was. It's not like that at all. So we are in the realms of, I think, largely beautifying the book, to be honest, because in many cases we have no idea who commissioned the painting. If we knew, say suddenly Daniel Moore says, I want to commission an illustrated picture book of something, he would say what he wanted, and the artist would presumably give him what he wanted, and there'd be a reason. In other words, one would be able to say, well, you know, he wanted this because he ran a travel company and he wanted pictures of unusual buildings or different angles. He wanted to look interesting. He wanted, you know, there'd be a reason for it, and therefore one could at least decide why pictures have been chosen, why this scene and not that scene, maybe even how it was depicted, and, you know, like this. But when you don't know at all, when all you have is the book, and often very few clues about the ownership, and certainly very few clues about who commissioned it, because there were commercial ateliers, especially in Shiraz in southern Iran, And there was a very well documented and interestingly documented appetite for Persian manuscripts in Istanbul among the Ottomans in the 16th century. And they were collecting these manuscripts. And so we don't know what they were asking for. Did they say, I want just to give me a nice picture book of Timur, or were they saying, you know, bring out pictures of this? So if one knew more, we could understand. So I think that's why we're reduced at the moment in almost every case. I mean, there are some royal commissions, but in almost every case, we're depicting an image of a ruler rather than a ruler, if you see what I mean. This is a sort of an ideal. This is what a good ruler does. This is what a powerful figure like Timur does. He wins battles, he defeats the enemy, he cuts them in half. He goes on a big hunt afterwards, and then he has a party. You know, basically, that's what we're talking about. And then it's how deep is your pocket? Some of these manuscripts have only got 4 or 5 pictures. Some of them have got 30. Some of them, you know, like this. I mean, they're all different. I mean, that's what's so interesting. Even manuscripts where we happen to know that the scribe is the same, and they're dated. There are about 6 manuscripts, all written by the same scribe, called Murshid in Shiraz, and the pictures are fitted into these manuscripts in the same place, but it's not always the same choice of picture. So it's all very interesting. I see a question here: do we know the scribes or the artists? Almost never at this stage. We don't know. If you read that remarkable book, My Name is Red, that's all about artists in the Ottoman court in the Toqtamish palace, being named and identified. At the moment, it's a major part of connoisseurship. You know, you have painter A did these pictures, painter B did those pictures. Someone does the figures, someone does the landscape, someone maybe does the horses. But most of them are anonymous for this period. Yeah, pity.
Well, Charles, one last question by the look of it. Why do we call him Tamerlane?
Well, because in Persian, he's Timuri Lang. Lang means lame, and it's an adjective. Timur-i Lang is the E joins them up. Timur the lame, because he was wounded in a cattle raiding exploit early on in his career, and he was apparently lame in one of his legs. You don't see this in the pictures, of course. So that's an anglicization of Timur-i Lang. That's why Tamerlane.
Well, Charles, thank you very much indeed for the
pleasure
today. And we'll obviously have to commission a picture of you now.
Yes.
I'm not sure who to go to for that, but we will.
No, well, certainly not.
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, and, pleasure. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And to everyone, thank you very much. Cheers. Bye.